Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. This is your host, Alex Sakin, and today we're going to be continuing our series on the secret history of the 20th century. Today's article is called The Hidden Hand in the Price of Secrecy. That's what we're going to be going over. And this is going to be part 7 in a multi-part series that is going to stretch even further into the future. I have about 12 sections planned overall for this. So this is by far the longest chapter in this overall book project that I've been doing on my Substack and on my podcast over the past year and a half. It's called Philosophy as Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And this is the 8th chapter in that overall book project. And I'm planning on just having one more chapter after this. My plan is for this to be the second to last chapter in this very long book project. And so just to set the stage a little bit, in this Secret History of the 20th Century chapter that I've been doing the past couple months, the basic outline that I have set up is that the first 4 articles and podcast episodes were built around an analysis of how a sort of capitalist oligarchy came over from Europe and took control and gained influence in America and sort of co-opted America's democratic institutions from basically the first few decades after the founding of the country. And so that was the story that I was building up, and moving into the industrial age, I was showing how this oligarchy kind of evolved, and we saw the rise of the robber barons, and figures like J.P. Morgan. Those were prominent characters in those first few articles. Then, starting with part 5 of this series, I introduced a new layer of analysis. So this layer of oligarchy continues throughout the 20th century and is very important. We obviously know, even up to today, how important it is when we look at things like Occupy Wall Street and the 1%, and sort of the total domination of the wealthy and the elite over the sort of labor classes. These remain factors today. So this level of oligarchy analysis is continuous throughout this century and beyond. But it's only one level. So there's another level that I introduced beginning in part 5, and that has to do with this idea that at the heart of the American national security state, which is highly compartmentalized, it's hard to know what exactly it looks like. But at the depths of it, I think, is a secret society that is in charge of a breakthrough paradigm of scientific research and technology development that's based on the physics of the ether, an ether-based physics approach, which is a very ancient concept that comes from alchemy, actually. And it's my feeling that since the 19th century, there's evidence that this sort of secret society has existed. It may have initially emerged as multiple secret societies that were working on these type of technologies, but I think that there was a consolidation around the turn of the century. And I think that this sort of secret society is sort of concealed within and behind the national security state of America. And it's not just concealed from the public. I think it's concealed from the national security state itself, at least the vast majority of it. So that is the story that I've been building, starting with part 5, which was on Nikola Tesla, and sort of went over the basics of this ether paradigm. And then we continued it in part 6, which is the previous article, and that was called This Hidden Agenda Behind World War II. And I looked at the influence and role that this sort of secret society and this sort of alternate paradigm of physics played in the development of that war. And so in that article, I've really laid out my grand thesis of the war. And in this article, and in the one to follow, which I've already written, that I'm going to be going and revisiting that thesis that I laid out previously in part 6, and I'm going to be really going into detail now to explore it. So I'm not going to necessarily cover new ground in these next 2 articles, but I'm going to go into a lot of detail, and I'm going to really justify in a way that I think is very convincing that I think this sort of new layer of analysis is correct. It's a necessary element to understand what happened over the course of the 20th century. In particular, I think it's the only way to explain the sort of systematic collusion and interconnection that was set up both before and during the war between the military-industrial complexes of America and Germany, and also Russia. So these countries, which were outwardly warring with each other, inwardly at this new level of analysis, very secretly, there was an incredible amount of collusion and sharing of industrial technologies and secrets. And this was obviously okayed by the sort of elite planners within America's national security establishment. But I think this happened at a very secret level. And so in this article, I'm going to analyze what I think the mindset was. And I'm going to discuss how I think that the players involved with this collusion didn't necessarily know that there was a yet deeper hidden hand behind the scenes. I think that they had been themselves managed and sort of guided towards putting the system in place, because this hidden hand, as we'll see, needed the system to be set up, but it couldn't reveal itself. So in analysis I'm going to be doing, I'm kind of going to the psychology of what the oligarchy that participated, figures like the Rockefellers that participated in this collusion, how they had their own motives and incentives, and even how at the level of the U.S. sort of foreign policy establishment, national security state, how those elements had also their own motivations for doing this. And so because these different parties that were involved in setting up this system, which is really based around establishing a world energy cartel and world industrial cartel, and sort of to integrate the military industrial complexes at the most deep level within all these countries to establish a world system, how this, how the different parties involved each had their own motivation. And so there's the type of compartmentalization that we're going to be seeing that allows for a system to be set up with each person or each group involved, major player involved, having their own reason for doing it. And because each had their own reason and motivation, the ultimate reason and motivation that was held by this hidden hand, who I think is the real power player behind the scenes, how they could conceal themselves and mask their true intentions and purposes. And so my thesis for that, my basic grand idea that this is what was happening, I laid out in that previous article in part 6. So once again, in this article, part 7, and in the next one, I'm going to be really going to deep analysis of how I think this whole thing happened. And then in the article or two that are going to follow this one, I'm going to look at the Cold War, and I'm going to keep working with this idea and unpack it further to show how I think it explains what happened during the Cold War. And so that's sort of my plan for this Secret History of the 20th Century chapter, except for at the very end, I'm going to introduce one more level of analysis, and that's going to be a fourth tier. So we have our sort of normal outer sort of public version of history. That's the bottom level. Then we have this oligarchical tier. And then we have this sort of secret scientific technocracy tier that I'm analyzing in this middle part of this chapter. But at the very end, I'm going to add one more level of analysis, and then we're going to be looking at and revisiting this idea that we went into in our Francis Bacon chapter about the Rosicrucians and the invisible college of Francis Bacon and the vision that he laid out for the New Atlantis. And we're going to be incorporating the idea of the mystery schools back into the situation. So that's at the very end. And that's a level of analysis that I think is the ultimate situation that we need to factor in to understand not only the story of the 20th century, but actually the story of human history. How there's this sort of eternal institution that is initiatic in nature that was once called the mystery schools. So that's the ultimate end point that we're going to be looking at. And so this hidden hand that I'm talking about, this sort of scientific technology or whatever, I think that interfaces intimately with this final tier of the mystery schools, and that is really something that's getting transcendental and somewhat abstract when you're analyzing that. So it is somewhat different or somewhat separate from this hidden hand that I'm talking about, but I think it's working through it to set up what is essentially a global system of initiation. And so all these different tiers that I'm talking about, from the outer society to the oligarchy to the sort of guiders and protectors of this hidden technology, that this tier that I'm analyzing here, that actually each of the individuals involved in all these different levels are themselves being initiated or undergoing an initiation. And ultimately, it's the world soul as a whole that is carrying out this grand drama of history. And so it's that world soul that's actually undergoing this grand initiation. So that's the very last level of analysis that I'm going to be doing. And then just before moving on, I want to say my methodology that I'm talking about right now, these multi-levels and how they need to be synthesized together. I introduced this topic in the beginning of part 5 of this series on the class, which was called The Classified Science of Nikola Tesla. So that goes into a little bit more detail, is a little bit more precise and talking about this method of how I'm analyzing history and how I'm layering together these various levels of analysis, but ultimately they all need to be synthesized together. Okay. So with all that said, now the context being properly established, let's move into this article. Once again, it's called The Hidden Hand and the Price of Secrecy, and this first section is called The Hidden Hand. And so we're going to be jumping to that in 1 second. All right, this first section, once again, is called The Hidden Hand and the Price of Secrecy, and let's jump into it. This article, and the one to follow, builds directly on the material presented in my previous 2 articles, one titled The Classified Science of Nikola Tesla, and the other The Hidden Agenda Behind World War II. In those articles, I laid out a grand theory of why World War II took place and what the ultimate motives behind the war were. In this article, and in its follow-up that will be published soon after, I revisit that theory, going now into a more detailed exploration of it. One of the central premises of my theory is based around an analysis of the psychology of the various participants involved in this war. Different major players in the war were motivated by different belief systems and worldviews. These worldviews motivated them to play out certain pre-orchestrated roles, ones that served to advance the ultimate hidden agenda of an unknown and mysterious hidden hand operating quietly behind the scenes. Here we come to the idea of worldview perception management, introduced in the previous article. Like the parable of the blind men and the elephant, the war's different stakeholders each perceived a limited part of the whole, but did not understand the true nature of the entire beast they were beholding. This limited viewpoint allowed each of these actors to be positioned, without their knowledge, into playing a role that served a larger hidden agenda, one that only a secretive hidden hand behind the scenes was fully aware of. Here we come to another aspect of my theory. I believe that this hidden hand, an unknown secret society in possession of advanced knowledge of etheric energy physics and how to generate technologies using it, was primarily motivated by 2 aims. First, it needed to maintain monopolistic possession over this science and over the technology trees that could be developed using it, while also maintaining a position of absolute secrecy about its own existence, remaining completely disguised for the duration of its secret project. Its need for secrecy is not just about hiding itself from the awareness of the public at large. More importantly, it must maintain its secrecy in relation to the military hierarchy, capitalist oligarchy, and government officials who were responsible for enacting the war campaign. None could know of its existence or what secrets it held. To accomplish its aims while maintaining a position of absolute invisibility, this secret society strategically utilized the policy of penetrated operations, with loyal agents, themselves not aware of the full scope of its existence, nested within key sectors of each warring country. Once positioned, these agents could serve as a source of intel, while at the same time becoming agents of influence and misdirection. Their task would be to guide the trajectory of the worldview perceptions of each of the war's major players, while also influencing the direction of the strategic activities that they pursued. Overall, it is my view that to fully understand World War II, the Cold War, and everything that has happened since, we must factor in not only the existence of this hidden hand, but the means by which it was able to exert its influence while remaining unseen. To do this, we must be able to simultaneously perform a sociological analysis of what the main sectors and power structures within society are, including those pertinent to carrying out, financing, and supplying the war campaign, while at the same time performing a psychological analysis of what these major players believed, what they understood, and how they were motivated. This requires adopting a multi-tiered approach of analysis, building each frame or tier of analysis one by one, with the ultimate goal being, in the end, to synthesize the various frames together, with a dynamic understanding of the topic emerging as the end product or result. In the course of this article, I will be utilizing this format to investigate the idea that World War II was guided by a hidden secret society here in America, one motivated by the above-mentioned strategic concerns. I believe this hidden hand reveals itself when we analyze the wartime collusion between American and German financial institutions, industrial corporations, and technocratic policymakers. I also believe that this hidden hand reveals itself when we begin to analyze what happened during the war itself. Not necessarily in terms of the normal military battles you read about in textbooks, but rather in terms of the secret weapons development activities taking place in both Germany and America. I further believe that this hidden hand reveals itself when we factor in what happened to these secret research projects after the war, and how the immediate rise of the Cold War served to solidify a state of permanent secrecy and black projects research within both America and Russia. All these topics and more will be investigated in this article and its follow-up, which go together as twin articles. I wrote them together as one long article, but am splitting them up for readability's sake. These twin articles pair with the two articles that have preceded it, and will also pair with one or two more to follow, which will be on the topic of the Cold War. Altogether, these form a mini-series within the larger chapter on the secret history of the 20th century. If you have not read the two previously published articles in this mini-series yet, I recommend doing so first. They are called The Classified Science of Nikola Tesla and The Hidden Agenda Behind World War II. Before jumping in, I'd like to briefly go over how this article and its twin that is to follow are structured. The first of these two articles is largely dedicated to reintroducing and then building upon ideas and themes first introduced in our previous article, ones that have to do with the complex psychological dynamics at play among the different major players involved in the war. We will begin with an analysis of the Rockefellers, one of the most influential power players within the American deep state, before moving on to explore other relevant actors involved with the war. This all sets the stage for the discussion that takes place in the follow-up article, which is focused around the story of the secret empire of black weapons research projects run by the Nazi SS during the latter stages of the war, along with a survey of some of the so-called wonder weapons they allegedly produced. Of particular interest in both articles is the background connections that existed between American and German industrial concerns, both before and during the war. In my eyes, this is the key to the whole story, and is a factor that has been insufficiently appreciated by scholars interested in the war. With all that now said, let's begin our analysis. And that's the end of this first section, so that was kind of an introduction and preview to what we're going to be going into. All right, moving on, the first main body section of this article is called The Price of Secrecy. And we're going to be jumping into that now. All right, The Price of Secrecy. In the previous article of this ongoing series on the secret history of the 20th century, we discussed how, both before and during World War II, a systematic network of corporate and financial linkages were set up between the financial institutions and industrial corporations of Germany and America, two nations who were outwardly at war with each other. To account for this fact, I theorized that these links were established for a very important and far-sighted strategic reason. They set the foundations for what would become a centralized global cartel system. Through the establishment of this transnational cartel system, the classified military research projects being conducted by major world powers, most notably America and Germany, could be secretly coordinated and controlled in a top-down, centralized fashion by a hidden hand operating behind the scenes and working through agents strategically positioned within these cartels. This hidden hand is almost certainly connected to the mysterious 19th century secret societies who were conducting anti-gravity and breakthrough energy research, utilizing a now classified model of physics centered around the ancient alchemical concept of the luminiferous ether. For legitimate reasons, whatever secret society that rose to gain control over and consolidate together these covert research programs, bringing them under one common umbrella, had come to the realization that the types of technologies they were developing using this ether-based approach to physics could never be allowed to promulgate in a competitive geopolitical environment. Therefore, it needed to assure its own monopolistic control over both the science and the technology tree based around this paradigm, while at the same time concealing it from others, making sure that it was not independently rediscovered or used by any imbalanced entity who might develop weapons based around its principles and inadvertently destroy the world in the process. This necessity sets up an additional mandate that this secret society would have had to take on. While keeping the most advanced aspects of this breakthrough science and technology to itself, it must also formulate a long-range plan to covertly bring about a worldwide reformation in human affairs, so that one day these technologies could actually be brought out into the open and put to constructive use. The system of world civilization that must be established before this happens is one that features, at minimum, an integrated system of world government possessing full spectrum dominant security control over the world population, so as to ensure that these technologies remain in secure control and never become utilized for competitive and militaristic purposes. In order to achieve this grand reformation, the nations of the world, led by America, would have to be incrementally guided in the direction of establishing this system of world government. But in the process, no player or group outside of those initiated into this secret society could know the real reason why the push toward global government was so necessary. Not the public, not the capitalist oligarchy, not the elected politicians, not the government bureaucracy, and not the military leadership. This means that each would have to come to the idea on their own, thinking that it was their own unique idea. But actually, each would have been led to this conclusion by the hidden hand. All knowledge concerning the real reason for world government must be tightly held within the initiatic structure of the secret society driving this campaign, with its own inner governance structure probably operating in a similar manner to how the Templars once functioned. In order to protect and conceal the real reason for world government within its own structure, while at the same time orchestrating a campaign to bring its grand strategy to eventual fulfillment, an elaborate campaign of worldview perception management must be enacted at every level of world society. Here, different major players on the world stage would be maneuvered, without their knowing, to perform certain vital roles and tasks necessary to the hidden hand's larger grand project, but doing so in such a way that they believed they were performing these actions under their own volition and free will, for the accomplishment of their own purposes. This latter part is important. Each sector has to be given enough leeway to pursue their own purposes, as long as these don't entail rediscovering the deep secrets of etheric energy that the hidden hand maintains within its innermost structure. But short of this, each has to be enabled to pursue its own selfish ends, with all kinds of collateral damage taking place as an inevitable result. I believe that this scenario provides the only plausible explanation for why so many systematic linkages were set up between American and German financial and economic institutions before the Second World War. According to my research, the various persons and institutions involved in forming this interlocked cartel structure were doing so on behalf of their own motivations and interests. This means that each had their own reasons and drives for participating in this system of collusion. Each had been led or guided toward participating in this situation. Consequently, none understood the larger game being played behind the scenes. This was deliberate and necessary. Because each player was confined to seeing only the small part of the larger whole they were participating in, each could be entrusted to perform certain roles and tasks necessary to the larger project, one they by necessity could know nothing about. In other words, not realizing that their worldview perception had been managed, each was led into performing certain actions necessary to the larger grand project, all the while remaining completely unaware that this was the case. Let's pause and consider what this does and doesn't mean. The need for absolute secrecy means that the hidden hand behind this larger project could not directly censure or block certain actions that its chosen instruments were performing. For example, the hidden hand couldn't say, "Don't drop those bombs," or "Don't persecute those people." It couldn't do anything like that, because to do so would be to reveal its presence. For this hidden hand, secrecy was that important, that necessary to its ultimate goal. Given the stakes involved with the types of technologies we're dealing with, recall back to what Tesla said about them, was there really any other option other than to stay silent and direct the overall grand project from behind the scenes? Whatever we may think or judge, clearly those initiated into the secrets of etheric energy deemed it necessary for knowledge about this science to stay absolutely hidden, quiet, and secret. As custodians of this knowledge, they had to do the same, performing their work through the use of specially chosen agents, themselves likely unaware of the whole project, who were seated into key areas of the operation where they could exert a timely and strategic influence. As a test of this theory, let's investigate a case study: the Rockefeller dynasty of America, the owners and operators of the Standard Oil cartel and a number of adjacent enterprises, including Chase Bank of New York. Everywhere you look in 20th century geopolitics, you find the Rockefeller family involved in some capacity. It is not an exaggeration to call them one of the founding fathers of the American deep state, in particular because of the vital role that Standard Oil played in the rise to power of the Pax Americana, or the American Empire, during the early decades of the century. The questions we will be considering are, in performing these actions, what were the Rockefellers' motivations? What did they believe in? What led them to do what they did? Furthermore, how deeply did they think? What did they really know? How far-sighted were their ambitions? And most importantly, were they read into this deeper game of etheric energy, or were they out of the loop? Likewise, in working to establish the institutional architecture of American Empire, did they realize that they were performing a valuable and necessary service on behalf of an extremely secret hidden hand? Or had their worldview perception been managed, rendering it invisible to them? In short, were they truly the movers of world events as they outwardly appeared to be? Or were they actually the ones being moved by some player working behind the scenes? In the case of the Rockefellers, we can actually track fairly closely what it is they believed, i.e. what their worldview was. And as it turns out, there is no evidence to believe they knew or understood anything of the breakthrough scientific concepts or energy technologies being developed within the core of the American deep state right under their noses. By tracing where and how they invested their money through family foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, we come to understand that this dynasty of robber barons was preoccupied with an entirely different scientific worldview as that suggested by etheric physics. They were materialists, in other words, and the scientific worldview they believed in and financed with their money was one premised upon the paradigm of scientific materialism. This is literally the exact opposite worldview of that which would be held by any group possessing knowledge about the secret science of etheric energy. Again, reconsider the statements of Tesla on the topic stated in Part 5 of the series. It is not possible to understand the nature of etheric energy and maintain a materialistic concept of existence. When we consider what the nature of the Rockefellers' business was, establishing corporate monopolies over resources like oil, food, and medicine, we find that a materialistic worldview would have suited them just fine. In fact, they naturally would have been drawn toward it, as it served to justify and legitimate all the activities they were pursuing. When we look closely at the values professed by the Rockefeller clan, we find that their psychology had a natural disposition toward a materialistic and reductionist mode of thinking. For one, their attitudes and beliefs fostered a cynical and elitist view toward their fellow man, one that served to justify the extreme asymmetry in wealth that they held over the population at large. At the same time, their materialistic belief system motivated them to seek ever-increasing amounts of control over the world's resources, consolidating more and more of Earth's natural bounty into their own hands. It just so happens that this consolidation of control over world resources was also in the interest of the U.S. national security establishment, and so the two made natural allies with each other. In this light, the Rockefellers were used as assets of the U.S. deep state, mechanisms through whom economic warfare and other instruments of soft power could be wielded. The Rockefellers' cynical, self-serving, and highly materialistic worldview was then reinforced and further self-justified through the formation of a twisted feedback loop, where the family used their wealth to fund the rise of various scientific, academic, and governmental institutions, which employed scientists and technocrats who shared similar sympathies. These hired hands worked to produce academic theories, consumer products, government legislation, and other outputs, which together worked to further justify the Rockefellers' own pre-established beliefs, while also serving to further spread their worldview into society, indoctrinating others with it. In this way, the Rockefellers, along with other like-minded oligarchs in their peer group, came to mold society in their own image, utilizing their outsized wealth, power, and influence in order to do so. Of course, the hidden hand behind the American deep state, the one in charge of etheric science and technology, would have possessed within its inner structure an entirely different worldview and set of ideas and beliefs. Consequently, my guess is they most likely wouldn't have wanted to see the Rockefellers institutionalizing their distorted worldview into society, spreading it like a mental contagion. But then again, this course of events would have served to further shield its own existence. If everyone is infatuated with scientific materialism, no one is looking for etheric science, its exact opposite. And the Rockefellers' actions proved useful in other ways. They consolidated wealth and power centrally, something necessary to the hidden hand's larger long-term goal, while at the same time they worked alongside America's foreign policy establishment to project American power globally and create the basis of world empire, another need of the hidden hand. The situation is a delicate one. Though one thing is for sure, the hidden hand couldn't pop out and tell them, no, you're heading in the wrong direction, because to do so would reveal its own presence. Therefore, they stayed silent and let the Rockefellers, in complete ignorance, do the work of building out the institutional architecture of global civilization. So the Rockefellers were left to carry on their work, systematically corrupting society in the process, but at the same time serving certain useful and necessary purposes of the hidden hand's greater long-term agenda. When we consider the truly profound influence that the Rockefeller clan has had in shaping our world, and the dire consequences that have emerged as a result of this influence, we realize what the true price of secrecy really is. When the light of truth is blocked from being revealed, a shadow world is created, one that promotes all the wrong values and rewards all the wrong behaviors and beliefs. This happens due to a breakdown in the feedback loops necessary for human behavior to course correct itself. The need for secrecy breaks down these feedback loops. As a consequence, the human psyche's natural course-correcting procedures are dammed up and blocked off, and the rise of shadow complexes of all types emerge as an inevitable consequence. The story of the Rockefellers is a case study of this. With no disciplinary agent rising to check their actions, the Rockefellers have grown unbelievably wealthy and powerful. This power is felt on two fronts, in the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy, which they are an integral player in shaping, and in the establishment of an interlocked system of corporate corruption, one that Vandana Shiva has called the poison cartel, and which is responsible for leaving much death, disease, ugliness, pollution, toxicity, and suffering in its wake. So the question is, why did they do this? Clearly a large part of the reason is because they profit off it. But also a significant part has to do with a breakdown in the feedback loops that might otherwise discipline, censure, and course correct the types of activities they have become engaged in. And why have these feedback loops broken down, allowing certain behaviors to persist that should otherwise be disciplined and eliminated? Because of the need for secrecy. In philosophical terms, secrecy necessitates the formation of a shadow, and entities like the Rockefellers, the Nazis, and more generally the deep state emerge as manifestations of this shadow. The conflicting mandates of the hidden hand, its need for absolute secrecy, and at the same time its need to build out the mechanisms for world government while maintaining centralized control, creates an impossible situation, one in which there doesn't seem to have been any alternative other than to let this shadow take hold. In literal terms, this means allowing entities like the Rockefellers to run roughshod over American society, and in the process shape into formation a social order built in their image. Of course, at the final stages, the world order they think they're putting into place will not be established, because once all the instruments for world government have been fully set up, they and their corporate empire become expendable. In the end, we find that all along they were quote-unquote useful idiots, performing certain necessary functions on behalf of a greater entity they knew nothing about. But in the meantime, they have built up a legacy that has left much death, destruction, and suffering in their wake. Again, this is the price of secrecy. Okay, that's the end of that section. Next, we're going to be going deeper into the Rockefellers, and we're going to look at the Rockefeller Foundation, eugenics, and the Nazi connection. That's the title of the next section. All right, picking back up, the Rockefeller Foundation, eugenics, and the Nazi connection. In his research into the history of American empire, F. William Engdahl highlights the idea that there was major differences separating America's ascendant oligarchical class from that of its European predecessor. The main difference has to do with the fluidity of America's oligarchy. While Europe's aristocracy tended to restrict entry to those of noble birth and bloodline, he writes, America's wealth-owning classes had more or less an open admissions policy, with entry depending solely on wealth and access to power. The difference between the two, in large part, has to do with the economic environment that America's new money class was formed within. Its rise coincides with the onset of the industrial age. Consequently, America's robber barons, many from humble backgrounds, were those who rose to power during its early periods of economic industrialization. They gained their fortunes by amassing monopolistic control over key industries and economic sectors, often in a ruthless and heartless fashion. Those who rose triumphant out of this cutthroat environment were the ones who became the movers and shapers of American history, figures like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. Elaborating on this situation, Engdahl writes how, in the closing centuries of the 19th century, anyone clever, determined, and ruthless enough to win the Darwinian Survival of the Fittest award by amassing a huge fortune and holding on to it was eligible for membership in America's oligarchy, almost regardless of class, religion, or national origin. The type of person who won this Darwinian survival of the fittest contest tended to operate according to a certain mode of psychology, one that favored a greedy, elitist, non-empathetic mode of behavior. This was valuable for winning the game of Monopoly, but disastrous in terms of labor relations. It would also have dire consequences for democratic society as a whole, as it was these same robber barons who would soon use their wealth to influence the trajectory of government policy, both at home and abroad. After all, it was the larger populace of working-class laborers who were the ones constantly threatening to strike in order to win concessions like higher pay and better working conditions. Likewise, it was also the larger populace who would benefit from nationalizing or socializing the key industries that the robber barons held monopolistic control over and gained their wealth from, such as railroads and energy. Given that, from the perspective of the oligarchs, these two outcomes were to be avoided at all costs, it was natural that they should take a competitive and antagonistic view of the population at large. Philosopher Manly P. Hall aptly summarizes the type of elitist and self-serving mindset that came to characterize these oligarchs. He writes how these elites tend to see themselves as a people set apart from the rest of the world, for whom the rest of the world was created, and whom it had a perfect right to enslave and dominate. The major fallacy in this worldview, he writes, is to believe that some minority of mankind is greater than the rest. This viewpoint is soon paired with another, that the great masses of human beings are bound to be servants, that they are fulfilling their proper destiny when they serve specialized groups. In this way, the oligarchs tend to adopt the self-aggrandizing view that they somehow uniquely represent a sort of flower of the earth, from which it then follows that it is the common duty of the mass of people to protect and preserve this flower. As we will be exploring, the Rockefellers came to personify in an almost archetypal manner the type of elitist and self-aggranding attitude described above. Certainly, they weren't the only ones in America's ruling class who felt this way, but because of the incredible influence they came to amass in almost all areas of modern life, it is worth exploring in detail what it is they thought and believed. As we delve into their history, we find the Rockefellers expressing the clear and unambiguous belief that their success was due to an inherent superior Darwinian genetic fitness that they and their oligarch peers possessed over the populace at large. This belief system was used by them to self-justify the incredible wealth and power they had amassed and wielded over the population at large. It was also used as a means to justify their pursuit of a plan to use their wealth, power, and influence to create a world order built in their own image, one that would de-emphasize democracy and promote plutocracy in its place. The elitist mentality of the Rockefellers is made clear once we begin tracking the areas that they began investing their money in after they founded their highly influential philanthropic foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, in 1913. Much of the growing influence that the Rockefellers would come to wield over American society was enacted through their family foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. By following the money of this foundation, we can learn something about the mind state that these oligarchs possessed and the motivations that drove them as they maneuvered to create an American imperium with themselves and their fellow oligarchs enthroned at its center. In his book, Seeds of Destruction, Engdahl gives the background story of how this influential foundation was first set up. The story relates back to the founding of the Federal Reserve, America's privately owned central bank institution. The same year that the bank was founded, a constitutional amendment was passed requiring a federal income tax. The function of this tax base was to establish a foundation upon which the Federal Reserve's debt lending policies could be anchored. Certainly, paying an income tax would negatively impact the big money interests on Wall Street. But, as Engdahl explains, conveniently enough for Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the very wealthy, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the 16th Amendment, had also been ratified in 1913, the same year. With this amendment, it was specified that the very rich could avoid most taxation by protecting their wealth in new tax-exempt charitable foundations, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, created the same year as the income tax. At first, the implications of this new amendment were largely overlooked by the wealth-owning class. For example, as Engdahl explains, J.P. Morgan, who actually I think died this year, so let's just say the House of Morgan in general, never found the time or inclination to organize its vast wealth into tax-exempt foundations and to extend its influence far beyond the confines of their bank and corporate holdings. But John D. Rockefeller, on the other hand, after a wave of bad publicity, was convinced of the public relations advantage of such a move. In particular, it was Rockefeller's principal business advisor, Frederick T. Gates, who suggested that he organize his wealth into a tax-exempt foundation after 1913, using tax-free funds to extend the power and influence of the family in a manner somewhat like an American Medici, absent the cultural refinements, but cloaked in the myth of philanthropy. In this manner, the Rockefeller Foundation was incorporated in New York State in 1913 under the direction of Gates, whom Rockefeller called the greatest businessman he ever encountered. Once established, Gates would focus the new foundation's activities on programs that would dramatically leverage Rockefeller wealth, but above all, the family's political and social power. The long-term consequences of this strategy were huge. As Engdahl writes, under this mantle of philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation would reshape the map of the entire world. The programs and mechanisms through which it operated were phenomenally important, but little understood, as they were extremely well disguised. One of these programs was the War and Peace Studies of the late 30s and early 40s, which was conducted in association with the Council on Foreign Relations. This important initiative, discussed in one of our previous articles, would come to have a huge impact on the future of American foreign policy, establishing the foundations of America's post-war imperial strategy for decades to come. But even before then, going back around 2 decades to when the Rockefeller Foundation was first started, we can begin tracking the flow of Rockefeller funds toward the financing of certain initiatives, ones that it is clear were important to them and their worldview. Oil industry historian Timothy Mitchell, who has performed extensive research into the Rockefeller dynasty, explains that one of the causes of world problems, as the family saw it, was the persistent tendency of the human species, at least the less wealthy portion of it, to reproduce and multiply itself. An increasing number of people meant a greater potential to cause trouble and to demand a bigger slice of the pie. In their minds, it was necessary to, in their own words, restrict the breeding of the feeble-minded. These problems could be addressed through social control. As a result of these views, the family became one of the early backers of the American eugenics movement, which had emerged around this period among elite circles in America's oligarchical class. The primary concern of the eugenics movement was to develop a population control strategy that could be implemented upon the lower classes of the earth, those who were seen as less fit and were therefore less justified in reproducing themselves. Eugenics was born as a product of the Darwinian theory of evolution mixing with the mathematical work of Thomas Malthus, who, back in 1798, pointed out how, in biological systems, populations tended to expand geometrically while food supply grew only arithmetically, leading to periodic famine and death, which served to eliminate the surplus populations. These ideas were synthesized in the late 19th century by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, in the form of eugenics, which he defined as the science of improvement of the human race germplasm through better breeding. He also described it as the study of agencies that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, whether physically or mentally. The Rockefellers did not invent the ideas of this movement, but having ample resources at their disposal, they became one of its biggest promoters and amplifiers. Engdahl explains that one of the first philanthropic projects undertaken by the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s was to fund the American Eugenics Society and the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, where, by 1917, John D. Rockefeller had become the office's second largest supporter after the Harriman family. In the 1920s, the Rockefeller Foundation moved to finance Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood Federation of America, initially known as the American Birth Control League, a racist association promoting eugenics in the form of population control and forced sterilization under the guise of rational family planning. Revealing the underlying mindset of this movement, Sanger once wrote that the imbalance between the birth rate of the unfit and the fit is admittedly the greatest present menace to civilization. Zooming out, we discover a trend that really is not all that surprising. The Rockefellers and their peers, in order to justify their extreme asymmetries in wealth and power that they held over the masses, had come to adopt an elitist, racist, and Darwinistic view of life. To them, ideas like eugenics served to confirm, rationalize, and further justify the self-aggrandizing beliefs they already held. As Engdahl further explains, the pseudoscience of eugenics served as a kind of divine proof of their superior survival traits over less fortunate mortals. Because of the scientific veneer that blanketed the eugenics movement, the oligarchs were able to self-justify their own asymmetric hold on power and wealth, explaining their position away as being due to their own genetic fitness. Here we find the old monarchical belief in rulership by divine right recapitulated in a modern form, clothed now in the language of science. But actually, as activist Vandana Shiva emphasizes, the issue is really about control. Then, as now, the prejudice of the super rich and their fear of women, the poor, the migrant, and the colored shapes what they call science as the ultimate objective truth, when in reality it is the articulation of subjective prejudice, of fear of the other, of the uncontrollable urge to dominate. One of the main fallacies in the eugenics view, and there are many, is that it is based upon an assumption of genetic determinism, that the genes make the person. Thus, those who struggle in poverty do so because of their inferior genes. Other social, political, cultural, and environmental factors are irrelevant. Engdahl elaborates on the reductionist reasoning underlying the eugenics movement. He points out that at root, the entire field is premised upon the idea that a complex life form could be reduced to elementary seeds, from which all traits of the life form could be deduced. Therefore, from the perspective of the reductionist mindset of materialist science, it was logical that human problems on the psychological and social level could be pinpointed to causes arising at the level of genes. Thus, according to the thinking of elites, by manipulating genes, the elites could engender changes in the collective scale. Eugenics was born from this philosophy. Vandana Shiva, in her book Oneness versus the 1%, takes further aim at this mindset. She writes that, at root, genetic determinism and genetic reductionism are an attempt to force life itself into a mechanical mold. They are not a natural evolution of society's intellectual search for understanding the world of which we are a part. Rather, they are a political project of domination and control. She emphasizes that the genetic engineering paradigm did not evolve naturally. It was artificially constructed by the big money of Rockefeller, the richest man of his time. Today we find this rationale used to promote ideas like GMO foods, which the Rockefeller interests were pioneers in developing and patenting, and which contemporary organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have been carrying the torch to continue. But, as Shiva informs us, the whole paradigm has its roots back in the eugenics movements of the 1920s and 30s, and the colonial mindset that it reflects. She writes how eugenics was an important part of the project of the construction of the gene. The roots of today's genetic engineering thus lie in the genetic reductionism and genetic determinism beliefs of the 1930s. Then as now, the issue is control. One of the keynote policies advocated for by the eugenics movement was that of forced sterilization. What many will be shocked and disgusted to discover is that, under funding from oligarchical dynasties like the Rockefellers, numerous mass sterilization campaigns were enacted all over the Third World and also among poorer ethnic communities here in America. Here, Engdahl comments that, for most Americans and for most of the world, the idea that the leading policy circles of the United States government, acting on the behest of some of its wealthiest families and most influential universities, would deliberately promote the mass covert sterilization of entire population groups was too far-fetched to accept. And yet it happened. With individuals with names like Rockefeller, Harriman, J.P. Morgan Jr., Mary Duke Biddle of the tobacco family, Cleveland Dodge, John Harvey Kellogg from the breakfast cereal fortune, and Clarence Gamble of Procter & Gamble, quietly funding eugenics as members of the American Eugenics Society. They also had been financing experiments in forced sterilization of inferior people and various forms of population control as early as World War I. Many books have been written and much research conducted on this topic, so I won't go into too much detail here, but I will point out that these programs have secretly continued up to the modern era. For example, in Brazil, millions were unwittingly sterilized with an emphasis upon its native black population. Here Engdahl explains that the Brazilian government was shocked to find that an estimated 44% of all Brazilian women aged between 14 and 55 had been permanently sterilized. Most of the older women had been sterilized when the program started in the mid-1970s. The government found that sterilizations had been carried out by a variety of different organizations and agencies, some Brazilian. They included the International Planned Parenthood Federation, the U.S. Pathfinder Fund, the Association for Voluntary Surgical Contraception, and Family Health International, all programs under the aegis and guidance of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or U.S. aid. Decades earlier, in the 1950s, one of the Rockefeller clan, John D. Rockefeller III, had made Puerto Rico into a huge laboratory to test his ideas on mass population control. By 1965, an estimated 35% of Puerto Rico's women of childbearing age had been permanently sterilized, according to a study made that year by the island's public health department. As part of this program, poor Puerto Rican women were encouraged to give birth in sanitary new U.S.-built hospitals, where doctors were under orders to sterilize mothers who had given birth to 2 children by tying their tubes, usually without the mother's consent. This brings us back to World War II and the investments that the Rockefeller family were making into German society, ones that included not only corporate collusion with German cartels such as IG Farben, but also, as we will see, the development of the Nazi racial ideology. Engdahl explains that, during the interwar period, in a Germany devastated by Weimar hyperinflation and economic depression, Rockefeller Foundation money came in to dominate and steer German eugenics research. This led to the Nazi program of forced eugenic sterilization, which was led by a Rockefeller-funded psychiatrist named Ernst Rudin. He was a prime architect of the 1933 Nazi sterilization law, which was co-signed by SS chief Heinrich Himmler, one of the most significant figures in Nazi Germany. Under this plan, Rudin called for sterilizing all members of an unfit individual's extended family. Under his sterilization law, some 400,000 Germans were diagnosed as manic depressive or schizophrenic and forcibly sterilized, and thousands of handicapped children were simply killed. In honor of his services, Rudin was twice honored by Adolf Hitler for his contribution to German eugenics and racial cleansing. I go over all this to illustrate how, on a psychological level, the Rockefellers might have felt ideologically drawn to develop the types of extensive corporate and financial ties with Nazi Germany that they did. Engdahl writes how, it is commonplace among researchers of the Rockefeller-Nazi connection that the two interests share a common ideology. For on the American side of the equation, the corporate elite viewed itself as an elite both of class and of race, fit to rule over the vast masses of human resources in its corporate empires, while the same attitude prevailed in Nazism as well. It was no secret what the Rockefellers believed and what their values were. The question is, did this make them easily manipulable targets for high-level strategists within the American national security state to use in order to pursue a larger game plan? It was no secret what the Rockefellers believed and what their values were. The question is, did this make them easily manipulable targets for high-level strategists within the American national security state to use in order to pursue a larger game plan? It seems clear, given their psychological mindset, attracted as they were to materialistic scientific notions like genetic determinism, that the Rockefellers were completely ignorant and kept in the dark about the alternative, ether-based scientific paradigm being nurtured and protected within the innermost sanctums of the American national security state. The two worldviews have nothing to do with each other. The Rockefellers' motivating drive seems to have been relatively simple and unambiguous. Grow their wealth, preserve their power, and form partnerships with organizations and institutions who will facilitate these ends. On one hand, this means partnering with America's military leadership. On the other hand, it means securing business deals with foreign cartels such as IG Farben, thereby opening up new markets for its business empire to move into. This means that the Rockefellers were amenable to accomplishing certain ends that the secret hidden hand behind the American deep state would have needed for the fulfillment of its own long-term agenda. And because of their own personally held motivations and ideologies, they would have been driven to pursue these ends for their own purposes, totally unaware that they were playing a part in a deeper game. Of course, the Rockefellers' ideology and tactics were horrendous, but perhaps this deeper scientific core would have had no choice but to work through them regardless. It simply couldn't reveal itself under any conditions, and therefore it couldn't pop up and say, no, you can't do that, do this instead. In this light, the Rockefellers, and the American foreign policy establishment they became intertwined with, may have been seen by the secret hidden hand as a necessary means to an end. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with their assessment, I'm just trying to reconstruct what the perspective of this hidden hand might have been. Something happened to bring all these events together. I'm trying to figure out what. It seems that the Rockefellers had their own motivations for wanting to do what they did, while the American foreign policy establishment that held close ties to the Rockefellers had their own independent reasons for pursuing world hegemony. Both sides were playing a part, not knowing that the infrastructure for world order they were working to put into place just so happened to be something that the deeper hidden hand needed. This hidden hand can never reveal itself, but nevertheless, it needed, with utmost necessity, for the mechanisms of world government to be put into place, and for America to be the one to do it. The Rockefellers and other elements within the American deep state, driven as they were by their own small-minded motivations, became useful agents to accomplish this goal, allowing the hidden hand to stay hidden. The whole time, these oligarchs held the belief that it was their vision that would be enthroned when the final shift to world government is enacted. But I believe that, at the final hour, once the necessary infrastructure has been all set up, the hidden hand will finally reveal itself and take control, sacrificing these oligarchs in the process, while revealing finally what his true plan really is. So that's the end of that section. That was, once again, called The Rockefeller Foundation, Eugenics, and the Nazi Connection. So I just want to point out and emphasize again there that I'm trying to recreate what the mindset might have been of this hidden hand for, on the one hand, existing and sort of orchestrating the move towards a global government and a centralized, industrial cartel infrastructure, and why those things would be necessary for it. And at the same time, why it would need to utilize, in order to stay hidden, it would need to utilize other actors on the world stage to set the system up. And so those other actors had to have their own motivations for wanting to pursue a world empire. And the sort of ideology of the Rockefellers is not that dissimilar from the ideology of the British Empire, meaning there seems to have long been a social space, dating back to the Roman Empire and in the days of the pagan empires, that kind of a mindset, that kind of elitist mentality. There's long been a space in human psychology for that to exist, and so this hidden hand didn't create that mindset. It was already existing, but I think they leveraged it. And so you might say, I agree or disagree with that. They should have stomped it out or whatever. But we have to remember the need for secrecy, and most of all, secrecy from that group, which already had its branches deeply extended. And so, that's kind of what I'm trying to reconstruct that mindset, and that's kind of how this is what I just went over is like how I kind of think about it. And I'm going to be further exploring that as we go on. So the next section is called the strategic mindset of America's national security state. So having now looked at the sort of business end of it, like the Rockefellers and what their interests were, I'm now going to look at the American national security state, and they're intertwined together, but they're not necessarily identical, because the people who run the national security state aren't the super billionaires. Like the billionaires have a huge amount of influence and fund a lot of the stuff that goes on. But at the end of the day, the people who run the national security state are like bureaucrats or technocrats. And so now we're going to look at what it is that is enthroned as an ideology within this social sector, this realm of society. So yeah, once again, this is called the strategic mindset of America's national security state. All right, let's jump now into this next section. In the previous section, we discussed some of the psychological beliefs and motivations that may have underpinned the Rockefellers' desire for wanting to grow and expand their corporate empire over the face of the earth, while systematically co-opting and corrupting democratic institutions in the process. This, of course, they couldn't have done without the involvement of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, who were themselves seeking to accomplish these same goals for their own reasons. A close and deep-rooted relationship exists between the spheres of government, military, and private corporate contractors. For example, ever since petroleum rose to become an essential feature of modern warfare, the Rockefeller family's Standard Oil empire became an essential asset of America's national security establishment. The former should therefore be seen as a direct extension of the latter, functioning in a role somewhat similar to how the British East India Company served as an instrument of Britain's world empire. In both cases, the corporate entity becomes an essential component of the larger imperial strategy of the nation-state. There is no clear separation for the two, as each requires the services of the other to maintain itself. Therefore, in the case of the Rockefellers, what is good for Standard Oil is seen as also being good for America's national security interests. Just consider that, at the beginning of the U.S.'s entrance into World War II, Standard Oil controlled 84% of the U.S. petroleum market, as well as a large share of foreign oil markets. It was the largest oil company in the world, and this made them a potent weapon of economic warfare for the US military. For this reason, it became essential to US national security for the Rockefellers to grow their monopoly hold on the oil trade. In a similar manner, it also became seen as essential for other American centralized cartels to promulgate, ones like General Electric, which will pop up later in our story. Does this explain the strategy of allowing key US industrial cartels to form patterns of interlocked corporate relationship with their counterparts in Germany? For example, Engdahl informs us that, after the Rockefellers, the next largest stakeholder in Standard Oil was IG Farben, the enormous petrochemicals trust of Germany, which at the time was a vital part of the German war industry. The Rockefeller-IG Farben relationship went back to 1927. Around the same time, the Rockefeller Foundation began heavily funding German eugenics research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes. Furthermore, the Rockefellers' bank, Chase Bank, played a vital role in arranging the financing of the Rockefellers' various German enterprises. For example, in 1936, as Hitler was occupying the Rhineland, the Schroeder Bank of New York formed a partnership with the Rockefellers called Schroeder Rockefeller & Co. Investment Bankers. Time magazine referred to the bank at the time as the economic booster of the Rome-Berlin axis. Forging these type of bonds allowed for these foreign cartels to be brought into the orbit of the U.S. deep state influence. It also created a mechanism by which U.S. intelligence assets could be integrated into the corporate structure of foreign industrial corporations. Was this the motivation that led policymakers within the U.S. foreign policy establishment to pursue this strategy? If these decision makers weren't privy to the hidden hand and its secret mandate to achieve a world cartel system, America's outer foreign policy elite needed their own rationale for pursuing the establishment of this system. Was this it? F. William Engdahl, in a series of books, has meticulously outlined the geopolitical grand strategy of the U.S. national security state. Here, I'm referencing its outer oligarchical branch, not its highly secret inner core. This outer branch is the one centered around the Council on Foreign Relations, which the Rockefellers, Morgans, and other key oligarchical power players helped set up and continuously interface with. The main geostrategic perspective of this group is one they inherited from their imperial British predecessors. This has to do with the classic balance of power tactic of maintaining a divided Eurasia, for the reason that the Eurasian continent is the world's axial supercontinent, to quote well-known American military strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, who actually isn't born in America, but he became very influential in American policy circles. In his book, The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski elaborates further, writing that, quote, a power that dominated Eurasia would exercise decisive influence over two of the world's three most economically productive regions, Western Europe and East Asia. A glance at the map also suggests that a country dominant in Eurasia would automatically control the Middle East and Africa. Therefore, with Eurasia now serving as the decisive geopolitical chessboard, it no longer suffices to fashion one policy for Europe and another for Asia. What happens with the distribution of power on the Eurasian landmass will be of decisive importance to America's global primacy. In the strategic thinking of the U.S. military, one method for exerting its influence in Eurasia was through economic and financial means, i.e., soft power. Another was through covert activities aimed at playing Europe's major powers against each other. The idea here is that it was far better for Eurasian nations to war with each other than to align together, because an aligned Eurasia would surely spell the end of the American oligarchy's plan to establish its own global financial and economic imperium. Simply put, as Engdahl informs us, the U.S. goal was to prevent at all costs the emergence of a Eurasian economic rival to American hegemony. This situation informs how America's military leadership viewed the war. Leading circles around the Rockefellers and Wall Street had resolved among themselves that all potential European rivals for power would have to grind themselves down in a mutual slaughter. For this reason, in the eyes of the influential U.S. elites grouped around the CFR, war was merely an instrument through which to extend their financial power in the post-war world and create an American imperium, one displacing not only the British Empire, but also the German Reich and any other potential European competitor. From the viewpoint of many lead industrialists in Germany, war was not the desired option. Consequently, there was always an opposition movement within Germany against the war hawks in the Nazi Party. with the constituency of this opposition group comprised of individuals from within German finance and industry, as well as in certain circles of the military high command. These parties had their own geopolitical agenda, one that focused on establishing a Lebensraum or zone of influence for Germany through economic means rather than military ones. As Engdahl informs us, they had their eyes set on a penetration pacifique, or a peaceful strategy, to the east, to move into the east of Europe, including at a certain point even the possibility of a peaceful alliance with the Soviet Union. The question many ask is, why did this group not receive support from the Americans for an overthrow of the Nazi Party? By now you should be able to answer the question. The establishment of a peaceful German-led economic imperium over Eurasia went counter to America's own imperial plans. America's oligarchical elite had their sights set on establishing an economic imperium of their own over the face of Eurasia. Therefore, America did everything it could to supply the Nazi Party and draw it into starting what would become World War II. Clearly, America wanted the war. It was seen as necessary to America's grand imperial strategy. One of the war's principal functions was to bleed out all of America's principal rivals in Eurasia, particularly Britain and Germany. This would eliminate each as a future rival to American hegemony, while ensuring their cooperation in the establishment of a post-war American imperium, one that was to be formed as a result of the war. Of course, in order to make all this happen, the German war machine had to be ensured of at least a certain amount of success. American financial and industrial support would make sure this would happen. As we explained in our previous article, the German Wehrmacht or war machine could not have functioned without the technological support of American industrial corporations like Standard Oil. Perhaps this justified, in the mind of America's outer military leadership, its foreign policy strategy of allowing American corporations to form tight interlinked bonds with German industrial cartels like IG Farben. This would allow the war to take place, which in turn would allow America's imperial grand strategy to advance to the next step. Of course, as we also discussed in the previous article, the extremely secret hidden hand operating behind the scenes had its own reasons for wanting these corporate ties to be established. It needed a world cartel that would mask the development of its own autonomous technology project. But America's own outer military leadership couldn't know of this, so they had to formulate their own rationale for pursuing the establishment of this world cartel. I think this balance of power rationale explains at least part of their mindset in pursuing these policies. By aiding and abetting Germany's war effort, the United States' larger agenda of establishing its own global empire was significantly enhanced. Here, Engdahl points out that the Rockefellers and their crowd were no more pro-German than they were pro-British. They were pro-American century, and above all, pro-Rockefeller in an almost monarchical sense. This helped explain why the American deep state formed tactical alliances with Nazi Germany one moment and with Russia and Britain the next. These were simply matters of expediency, tactics in pursuit of their larger strategic end goal, global American hegemony. Recalling the strategic need of the deeper hidden hand for an American-centered world empire to be established, the imperial mindset of America's foreign policy establishment made them useful allies. These American imperialists could be utilized as a means for building out the needed infrastructure for a world empire, but doing so under their own will and volition, and thus remaining ignorant of the deeper game plan being played out behind the scenes. In large part, I think this complex situation informs why the different levels of America's leadership structure did the things they did during and before the Second World War. Each was operating according to a different set of motivations and incentives, but these came together at the right time to carry out a plan that a deeper hidden hand needed to occur. All right, and that's the end of that section. So I have one more left in this article. It's called The Plan for a World Energy Cartel. And here we're going to be looking at some of the links that were established not only with Germany, but with the Soviet Union as well. So one centralized set of American financial and industrial interests had their hands in all aspects of the war. So that's next. All right, final section, the plan for a world energy cartel. The above-mentioned balance of power geopolitical strategy of America's foreign policy establishment informs not only why they financed and enabled the German Wehrmacht to wage war across Europe, it also explains why, back during the interwar period following World War I, they worked to covertly finance and industrialize the Soviet Union, preparing it to play its part in another future world war. A key figure in this effort was Averell Harriman, a senior partner in the deep state affiliated investment bank Brown Brothers Harriman, where he was joined by Prescott Bush, the father of future President George H.W. Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush Jr. The London branch of this bank also featured Montague Norman as a senior partner before he headed off to the Bank of England to become its central bank finance minister. Anthony Sutton, who we cited extensively in our previous article, reveals how, during the 1920s and 30s, the senior partners in this investment bank became major players in setting up a system of corporate collusion that linked together the military-industrial complexes of both America and Germany. Harriman, for example, became the New York banker for German steel magnate Fritz Thyssen. Meanwhile, Clarence Dillon, a close friend of Prescott Bush, created the German Steel Trust on behalf of Thyssen and held 2 seats on the board. Prescott Bush would also become involved, becoming a director of the German Steel Trust Union Banking Corporation during the 1930s. The situation escalates when we consider the fact that these same banking interests also had their hands in the rise of yet another military power of the time, Soviet Russia. For example, Sutton writes that in the 1920s, W. Averill Harriman was a prime supporter of the Soviets with finance and diplomatic assistance at a time when such aid was against State Department regulations. In particular, Harriman held direct ties to Ruscombank, the first Soviet commercial bank. As it turns out, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet industry fell into tatters. For it to rebound, something that was necessary for Russia to accomplish in order for it to become a suitable ally in a future war, it needed Western assistance. Harriman and Co. served as agents tasked with facilitating this technological and financial lifeline. Anthony Sutton has a whole book detailing the story. In it, he lays out the fact that the Soviets were entirely dependent on Western technology and assistance, and that agents of the American deep state like Harriman, who later became an ambassador to the Soviets, covertly worked to provide it to them. In fact, as Sutton writes, Stalin himself told Harriman as much back in 1944. Here's an extract from a report by Ambassador Harriman in Moscow to the State Department, dated June 30th, 1944. Quote, Stalin paid tribute to the assistance rendered by the United States to Soviet industry before and during the war. He said that about 2/3 of all the large industrial enterprises in the Soviet Union had been built with United States help or technical assistance. If we harken back to our previous discussion of America's balance of power strategy in its management of Eurasian geopolitics, we discover a prime driver behind why America would have sought to finance and support the Soviet Union, its supposed ideological enemy. In his research, Sutton uncovered a 1917 memorandum from a Wall Street lawyer doing business, state business, in Russia. This memo stated that, quote, the fullest assistance should be given to the Soviet government in its efforts to organize the volunteer revolutionary army. Furthermore, until the time when open conflict shall result between the German government and the Soviet government of Russia, there will be opportunity for peaceful commercial penetration by German agencies in Russia. So long as there is no open break, it will probably be impossible to entirely prevent such commerce. Steps should therefore be taken to impede, so far as possible, the transport of grain and raw minerals to Germany from Russia. Here it is clearly stated that American foreign policy at the time was to pit Germany and Russia against each other and to prevent their alliance. In Russia, the Bolsheviks were given access to Western industrial technologies so as to prepare them for a future war against Germany. In the meantime, the Americans were working to impress their influence over German industry, while at the same time financing the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime, who were staunchly anti-Soviet. Remember, there were numerous powerful interests in Germany who wanted to see the country develop a peaceful policy of economic expansion toward the East, including with Russia. The U.S. policy of covertly financing the Hitler regime undermined this. As Engdahl informs us, Hitler, quote, had been obsessed with a war to the death to destroy Bolshevism and the, quote unquote, inferior Slavic race, as he had stated more than a decade before in his book Mein Kampf. While classic balance of power geopolitics explains America's strategy of financing the military-industrial complexes of both the Germans and the Soviets, it seems that, beneath the surface, a deeper and more complex game plan was also taking place, one that concerns the engineering of a system of permanent corporate socialism back at home. In a previous article, we discussed how the Rockefeller interests became key players in setting up Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policy, where a national corporate welfare system was implemented that in many ways resembled the one that the Standard Oil cartel had pioneered decades prior within its own corporate structure. The system was not motivated by benevolent altruism. Instead, it was established as a means to head off destabilizing labor strikes and populist uprisings. Seemingly, the New Deal had the same intention. It would curtail the power of populist movements at home, letting the people eat cake, so to speak, while moving them into a further state of dependency on the same corporate cartels that were coming to dominate all sectors of the social landscape. Meanwhile, the corporate cartels who would both finance and become the recipients of all this new government spending would make a killing. Anthony Sutton elaborates on these points, writing that, quote, "The New Deal or the new economic order was not a creature of classic liberalism. It was a creature of corporate socialism. Big business, as reflected in Wall Street, strive for a state order in which they could control industry and eliminate competition." And this was what was at the heart of FDR's New Deal. As it turns out, at the same time that FDR was establishing his New Deal policies in the US, Hitler's Nazi regime was implementing a similar corporate socialism model in Germany, one he called the New Order program. As we've been covering, behind Hitler's regime, we find present the same American corporate interests as those behind FDR's New Deal. As Sutton points out, in brief, both Hitler's New Order and Roosevelt's New Deal were backed by the same industrialists and in content were quite similar, i.e. they were both plans for a corporate state. The plot thickens when we now factor in the involvement of the same nexus of American corporations in the development of Soviet Russia, perhaps the ultimate form of a corporate state. Despite its branding, Soviet Russia operated very little like a communist state, and instead is better understood as one vast centralized military-industrial enterprise, a vast corporation in other words, with the Soviet economy becoming something like an immense company store that all workers were forced to shop in. Zooming out, when we consider the development of this triangulated axis of corporate socialist states, America, Germany, and Russia, we find that each features the same nexus of American banking and industrial corporations involved in setting up each system. Furthermore, these same corporations were also involved in setting up the military-industrial complexes of each nation. Clearly, a far-sighted strategic policy is being enacted, a worldwide campaign of social engineering, which World War II and the later Cold War were crucial elements in advancing. Analyzing the situation further, we find not only the familiar Rockefeller interests being heavily involved, but also the well-known American industrial giant General Electric operating as a central player. On the topic of GE, Sutton emphasizes that the multinational giant General Electric has an unparalleled role in 20th century history. On one hand, the General Electric company electrified the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s, gaining an effective technical monopoly of the Soviet electrical industry. At the same time, General Electric also had penetrated German industry through the establishment of a German subsidiary called AEG, or German General Electric, with 3 GE men holding positions on its board. In Germany, GE also held ties to the powerful Siemens industrial group. Meanwhile, back in the States, GE served as one of America's most powerful military contractors. Here, one-time GE President Gerard Swope had helped to set up FDR's New Deal plan. In fact, initially the New Deal was called the Swope Plan. Perhaps not coincidentally, the Roosevelt family was at the time one of the largest stockholders in the General Electric Company. Delving deeper, we find the various GE industrial concerns becoming integrated together at an international level under the guise of a holding company called IGE, or International General Electric. This seems to be the point organization tasked with merging the world electrical industry into a giant cartel structure held under the control of U.S. deep state interests. Zooming out, Sutton points out that General Electric directors are to be found in each of these 3 distinct historical categories, i.e. the development of the Soviet Union, the creation of both Roosevelt's New Deal and the U.S. deep state, and the rise of Hitlerism. These suggest how elements of big business were keenly interested in not only the socialization of the world order, but also the establishment of a global cartel system under American control. Certainly, the U.S. national security establishment seems to have been facilitating this. Surely, this system could not have been set up without their planning and direction. The obvious question is, why? For me, there is only one plausible answer. The U.S. military-industrial complex was hiding a secret that had to be preserved at all costs. The secret was so powerful, so valuable, so devastating, that any and all means necessary were to be used to engineer a world order into being that could continue to protect and preserve the secret. This means that, in a covert and highly compartmentalized manner, the American national security state would need to work to establish the eventual conditions for an American-centered global government. This they did primarily through soft power means, with U.S. corporations serving as the primary means of U.S. power projection. As we've seen in Germany, Russia, and again back at home in America, U.S. corporations were utilized as the primary means for facilitating the new world order that would be needed to protect and secure America's secret. To me, this explains why the U.S. foreign policy establishment was maneuvered into facilitating the corporate capture of key industries around the world, bringing them all into a common cartel structure centered in America. On one level, this suited their own imperial interests, but the real motive behind the whole enterprise was held at the level of the hidden hand. The corporate elite who worked to implement the system profited immensely from it. That kept them fat and happy and incentivized them to not ask too many questions. This was necessary. It made them useful agents of a larger plan they would know nothing about. But the establishment of this world cartel system was only one aspect of the great plan. The next challenge was how to finally introduce the idea of either energy technologies to the U.S. military-industrial complex itself, so that it would be inspired to, in a slow, closely observed manner, begin the process of not only experimenting with this new paradigm of physics, but also install the infrastructure necessary to preserve, protect, and monopolize it for American control. The secret couldn't be kept forever from the U.S. leadership, because that would enable other nations to potentially discover and utilize it against the U.S. But at the same time, the U.S. military hierarchy also couldn't be given all the knowledge at once, nor could they know that a secret society at home already existed and had developed an advanced degree of mastery over the science of etheric energy while keeping this knowledge from them. The solution settled upon was to introduce the either paradigm to the outer branches of the U.S. military hierarchy from an outside source, one that had discovered it on its own, so to speak, but not really. I believe they were guided into discovering it. But anyway, from the perspective of the U.S. military, it appeared that they had discovered it on their own and begun experimenting with it, but hadn't made any truly significant or advanced breakthroughs. I mean, they had made some, and we'll go over that, but they hadn't really made any really, really, really big breakthroughs. So that's kind of the strategy. They wanted the hidden hand needed this to be discovered first by an outside source outside of the U.S. military hierarchy, and then for the U.S. military hierarchy to be introduced to the concept through that outside source. And in that manner, the hidden hand that was actually back at home quietly behind the U.S. military hierarchy would remain invisible. So introducing this new paradigm of energy technology to the U.S. national security state in this manner would serve to convince the military hierarchy at home that they were discovering something genuinely novel, something that hadn't been fully worked out yet. Therefore, the idea would be introduced to them as something new, something they would need to start from square one to learn about and experiment with. And who would the U.S. military need to rely on to help facilitate its own secret experiments into this new paradigm? The answer is clear. It would need the services of the corporate contractors behind the global energy cartel, the one that had now been set up with branches all over the world. It would also need the financing of a privately controlled international banking system, one that could facilitate the flow of large amounts of black budget off-the-books financing streams. In short, it needed something just like the Bank of International Settlements, which just so happened to have also been set up in the period preceding the Second World War. I believe that it was from within this global financial and industrial cartel structure that the hidden hand would do its work in terms of guiding and directing the national security state's progress in its experimentation with this new energy paradigm, making sure they didn't discover too much at once, and also that they didn't start using these technologies too soon, in such a manner that might spoil the long-term plans that the hidden hand possessed. In the meantime, the U.S. military hierarchy's newfound possession of this energy secret would motivate them to adopt a culture of absolute secrecy and control, one characterized by compartmentalized public-private partnerships and off-the-books operations and special access projects. At the same time, it would put the fear of God in them and light a fire under their asses, so to speak, to advance at breakneck speed the creation of an American-centered system of global governance. Is it a coincidence that these features are ones that the hidden hand just so happens to also need in order to fulfill its own master plan? This is where we come at last to the true agenda behind World War II and the untold story of the Nazi SS and the secret empire of black weapons research projects that they had set into motion during the latter half of the war. It was the SS and their secret weapons technology program, led by Hans Kammler, that was chosen by the Hidden Hand as the mechanism through which the new breakthrough paradigm of etheric energy physics would be formally introduced to the U.S. national security establishment. Through the SS, knowledge of this new energy paradigm came into the U.S. national security state, transforming it forever. And before this happened, decades before, the institutional architecture necessary to preserve and grow this hidden research project within the U.S. had already been set up, and in such a way as to ensure that the Hidden Hand could maintain hidden control and influence over the trajectory of the U.S. military's secret R&D program using these technologies. This, I believe, is the true significance of what really happened in World War II, the war to end all wars. And in the next article of our series, we'll move to investigate that story in greater detail. And that's the end of this article. So I hope you're following with the story that I'm building here and the analysis and methodology I'm using to build it. And you can see how this genius plan, this very far-sighted plan, was set up, decades in advance. And the whole purpose was to set up in advance of the war the infrastructure necessary for this research paradigm to then move into America and be grown domestically, but in such a way that this Hidden Hand would maintain control over it. And so, Nazi Germany was used as this sort of mechanism by which the outer aspects of the U.S. military were introduced to this paradigm. And so that's sort of my thesis. And so we'll be exploring that in greater detail in the next article, because the next article is all about the Nazi SS and their secret research program. But we're also going to look at all these links that existed in Nazi Germany that ties them into this U.S. deep state situation that had set up the sort of foundations of a world cartel structure. And particularly, they were heavily involved in Germany. So they not only financed the rise of the German party, but they also financed the rise of German industry. And this is something we covered a bit in our previous article. So their hands were in all aspects of it. So in the German, secret research projects, they had to utilize these corporate contractors that had been set up by these U.S. interests decades in advance. So it's a, complex situation, but I think if you're following me, you can see clearly the sort of strategy at play, and it was a far-sighted one, and actually quite a impressive one when you think about all the things that went into it. So anyway, we'll be picking back up with this next article in the next couple days. It's going to take me a day or two to finalize it and then record it and post it, but I'll have it out soon. And until then, thanks to everybody who has stuck around for this whole episode. I hope it paid off for you. And I'll be back soon. Thanks again. God bless.